Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. One of the worst things in the world I can conceive is having someone I love disappear and no one knows what happened to them. I've thought through this scenario in my head and I just don't know that I'd survive it. I don't. I'm a worrier and a ruminator by nature, and I just imagine myself sitting in bed at night, waking up in the morning, trying to eat dinner, watch a movie, all the while with that omnipresent thought that someone I love might be tied to a radiator in some creep's basement or stuffed in a box under a bed. I just don't know that I could live like that. So many families deal with the exact scenario I've just described, and it never fails to make me feel sad. Today we are talking about a man who took women from their loved ones, young women who ran away and were never seen again. They got upset or had an argument with someone they loved, and for that, they paid with their lives. This case also involves one of the most famous photographs known in the true crime community. A photograph that might look somewhat average until you know the story behind it. A photograph that frankly keeps me up at night when I start thinking about it. Today we are talking about Robert Ben Rhoades, the truck stop killer. Let's get into it. November 22nd, 1945. Robert Ben Rhoades was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa, but no one knows for sure where he was raised or much about his early life. We know that his father was in the military and that he was stationed in West Germany, so it is assumed that Robert was raised mainly by his mother in his early years. When Robert was in elementary school, his father returned from duty overseas and then went to work as a firefighter. Now, this would normally be the part where we talk about how when his father returned, he started abusing Robert and turned Robert's life into a miserable existence, because that's the story for most people who turn out to be serial killers later in life. But that doesn't appear to be the case with Robert, which just adds to the fascinating conversation as to why people do what they do. It appears that Robert's home life as a kid was pretty normal. Robert played football and he wrestled in high school. He was even in the school choir and the French club. He did okay in school and no one remembers him being strange or violent or bullied. He did get arrested in 1961 when he was 16. The charge was tampering with a vehicle. And then he was arrested again in 1962 at age 17 for getting into a fight. So those are normal and usual behaviors for a lot of teenagers. A lot of kids get into trouble when they're that age. Robert wasn't that guy out picking up roadkill and dissecting it like Dahmer, or plucking the eyeballs out of birds like Charles Albright. But still, he went on to do terrible things. Some would say some worse things. Robert graduated from high school in 1964 and joined the Marines. Something happened this same year that is very telling for me. Robert's father was arrested for molesting a 12-year-old girl, and while his father was waiting to go on trial, he killed himself. Now, if your father is molesting kids, there is a very good chance that he is doing that to his own kids. And if he's not, there is a great chance that the kids are aware in some capacity that their father is a deviant. So it's very telling that Robert's father was arrested, but I'm as interested in the fact that his father was a pedophile. That tells me a lot more about Robert's home life than one single arrest. So now Robert's father is dead by his own hand, and Robert started to spiral. In 1968, he was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a robbery. Robert then tried college, but dropped out pretty quickly. And then, what did he decide he wanted to be? Here are your choices, because we are in the true crime community. He's either going to become uber religious, or start saying he's a prophet, or become a petty thief, or go into law enforcement. Those are basically the choices. Well, Robert decided he wanted to be a cop. As you know, many serial killers and violent people show interest in law enforcement, which again, I've said this before, does not mean all people attracted to law enforcement have violent tendencies. That's ridiculous. But it is a fact that many people who have violent tendencies are attracted to positions of authority. And it's important enough that it become part of the conversation. It's something we have to talk about simply because we see it so much. Well, like so many serial killers, Robert was rejected by the cops. They didn't want him. It was most likely because of his dishonorable discharge from the military, but it also could have something to do with his psychological evaluation. Those are private, so we don't always know how those come back. I would venture to guess that even back then, there were some red flags. So Robert took some odd jobs and moved around a bit, and he got married. Not once, not twice, but 3 times between 1970 and the mid-1980s. He had a son with his first wife, and he bounced from job to job, finding work in warehouses and supermarkets and restaurants. And then he got involved in 2 things: truck driving and BDSM. 2 things that we see a lot of correlation with when it comes to true crime. Look, my bestie was a truck driver for years, and most truck drivers are the best people you ever want to meet. I always say if I break down on the side of the road, speaking in general terms, I would take help from a truck driver or a biker anytime. Those are the people most likely to help you and treat you well. But as with every facet of society, we have to have bad apples that spoil everything for everyone, and people like Robert spoil the truck driver's image. The BDSM thing. I know absolutely nothing about this scene. It's not something that appeals to me, and I'm not kink shaming anyone. I'm just assuming that that lifestyle is like any other. There are a lot of good people in it, and then there are some really, really bad people. And Robert, he's the worst of the worst. From everything I've read about Robert Ben Rhoades, I think the thing that makes him so extraordinary is how incredibly ordinary he is. This is a very, very ordinary man who did things that are so incredibly awful, they're difficult to wrap your mind around. There aren't a lot of things to point to in his personal life, at least not things that are publicly known, in order to say, this guy was a psycho. Even with someone like BTK, Dennis Rader, who looked like he was ordinary on the outside, but was then taking photos of himself like this in private, Robert wasn't doing that. He was into BDSM, but was kind of open about it. BDSM, by the way, stands for bondage, discipline or domination, sadism, and masochism. It's a sexual practice people participate in if they want to dominate or be dominated. Robert wasn't hiding that like BTK. He was pretty out in the open with his lifestyle. Robert Ben Rhoades was really, really into this scene, as you can see here. And we do know that he began to abuse, both physically and sexually, his third wife, Deborah. I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that Deborah was not the only person Robert abused in relationships. I'd be willing to bet many, many things on the fact that pretty much everyone who ever got close to Robert Ben Rhoades suffered. 1975 to 1990. Robert Ben Rhoades takes an unknown number of sex workers from truck stops. There will never be a way to know or a method to count how many women disappeared and lost their lives at the hands of Robert Ben Rhoades. Because you see, sex workers who work at truck stops are considered the lowest of the low. Every subculture has a pecking order, and in the world of sex work, being a lot lizard is at the very bottom of the barrel. These are women with no family, few friends, no ties to the community, most often with drug addictions, people that are hanging onto life by a thread. They are definitely not people who are going to be missed if they disappear, and Robert Ben Rhoades knew that. I saw estimates of 20 victims taken by Robert, but I've seen many more that say it's more like 50. Experts who have studied this case and studied Robert Ben Rhoades believe he has more like 50 victims. Now, I looked around for some specifics on why people believe that victim count to be so high, and I found differing answers. There are no names attached to those victims for the most part. There are a few. There aren't really solid dates, but there is this kind of looming number of 50. Why? Investigators assigned to these cases have spent quite a bit of time mapping out Robert's truck routes and matching his trucking routes up with women who went missing in the areas he was traveling while he was in that area. So this number of victims is really up in the air. It can't be substantiated, and there's a very good possibility that some of these missing women have nothing to do with Robert Rhoades. There's also a very good possibility that many of them do. For years, police in different counties in different states worked missing persons cases on the chance that the women were reported missing. When they weren't, sometimes the case would be opened because a body would be found. And that is the only reason we know about that murder. The woman was never reported missing, which is so sad. We do know that Robert Ben Rhoades was killing women up and down the freeway, and we know from the victims that were found out he was doing it in the most horrific way imaginable. April 1st, 1990. An Arizona Highway Patrol officer named Mike Miller is on his usual patrol route when he sees something suspicious. There's a tractor trailer parked on the side of the road, the side of the highway near Casa Grande, Arizona, which is not somewhere to leave a tractor trailer. Now, a tractor trailer sometimes is also called a semi. The trooper went to investigate, and what he found, we hear, and I say a lot, something out of a horror film, but you guys, this is literally something out of a horror film. So much so that I can't give you many details. The trooper walked up to the cab of the semi and shined his light inside. There was a naked woman chained up inside the cab of the truck with a gag in her mouth and a terrified look on her face. She was not only chained, but she was handcuffed and she was trying to scream. She was not alone. Also inside the cab of the truck was a man, and he identified himself to the officer as Robert Ben Rhoades. Robert told the officer that this was a consensual situation, a role-playing situation, and that it wasn't what it looked like. Thankfully, Trooper Miller didn't buy it, and he placed Robert under arrest. He then called for backup, and as he waited, with Robert in handcuffs, he began to search the cab of the semi. There he found a .25 caliber pistol hidden in a compartment. The woman inside the cab was later identified as Kathleen Vine. She was beaten and she was bruised, but she survived. Trooper Miller put Robert in his patrol car, handcuffed, but Robert made a break for it. He was able to get a door of the patrol car open and tried to run, but was captured again. Once Robert was in custody and the story of what the trooper witnessed began to spread through different law enforcement agencies, other cops began to wonder if this could be the man they'd been looking for in some of their old cold cases where sex workers were taken from truck stops. The arresting officer, a man named Rick Barnhart, was especially interested in trying to connect Robert to additional cases. I watched several interviews where cops talked a lot about their gut feeling, their intuition, and said that there was just something about Robert Ben Rhoades that piqued their interest, made their spidey sense tingle, and they wanted to know more about him. I'm a believer in intuition. If you've got intuition, listen to it. But I'm not a believer that you should use intuition to try to build a case against someone when that's all the evidence you have, a la Jean-Benet Ramsey. Based on Robert's truck driving route and the pattern of missing women that coincided with his travels, investigators were able to get a warrant to search Robert's house. This search would break the case wide open. As investigators went inside Robert's home, they found a packet of photographs. Included in the pile of photos was this infamous and horrifying image. This is Regina Kay Waters, and the story behind this photo is one that haunts me for days every time I see it. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But when the police found these photos, they knew they had a very, very dangerous man in their custody. There were photos of another female in the pile as well, and now they had to set out to identify her. Working backwards, investigators from many different counties and several states were informed of the capture of this monster, and they began to go through their records, attempting to connect cold cases in their jurisdictions to this newly discovered serial killer. In the beginning, authorities were hopeful that they would be able to draw some clear and convincing lines between their cases and Robert Rhoades. Unfortunately, it did not go as smoothly as they'd hoped. They wanted to get Robert on as many murders as possible, but while they worked on that, they planned to nail him to the wall on what they could prove he did. Let's talk about the girl in the photo. Regina Kay Waters was born in 1975 and by 1990 was having a tough time at home. When she was just 14, she ran away from her home and her family with her boyfriend, Ricky Jones, who was 18 at the time. The two were from really rough backgrounds and decided they were going to leave and make a better life for themselves. Sadly, that is just the opposite of what happened to them. They left their homes in Pasadena, Texas, and headed through Houston, planning to travel into Mexico. At some point in time, the couple crossed paths with Robert Ben Rhoades, probably while hitchhiking. Robert most likely offered the teens a ride, and once they were in the cab of his truck, it didn't take them long to figure out they were in a lot of trouble. Robert had converted the inside of his semi to a torture chamber. I have to be very careful about how I describe this, but whatever you're picturing, it's that and worse. Maybe one day I will do an episode that I will classify differently than I do my regular episodes. You have to tell YouTube kind of the category that you want your videos to fall in. Maybe one day I'll do an episode in a different category where we can openly discuss these things. You know, the Candyman, BTK, the Hi-Fi murders, Robert Ben Rhoades, because they're otherwise things that we can't really talk about here. But believe me when I say the things that this monster did, honestly, I kind of wish I didn't know. I do. Very shortly after picking up Ricky and Regina, Robert Ben Rhoades shot and killed 18-year-old Ricky. Ricky's body was not found until May of 1990. He was discovered near Harleton, Texas, and he had been shot once in the head. Regina, she didn't see such an easy end. Robert kept Regina for weeks. She spent those weeks locked in a dungeon-like chamber he had built between the two seats of the cab of the semi. Lots and lots of terrible details here. What I can say is that Regina was most likely wishing she had joined Ricky on that very first night, and I mean that seriously. What this girl went through, it's honestly something I don't like thinking about. Robert then started making a series of phone calls to Regina's father. This tracks with his interests in sadism, doesn't it? Taking pleasure in seeing people in pain. Robert would call Regina's father and tell him the things he was doing to Regina, and he also told her father that he had cut off all of her hair. This is what Regina looked like when she ran away. She had long curly locks, and this is what she looked like later on. After keeping Regina for a while, Robert drove her out to this abandoned house. He dressed her in this black dress and black heels, and he painted her nails red. He then took a series of absolutely horrifying photographs of her. This is the one that is the most famous. This is moments before her life ended. The hours I have spent looking at and thinking about these photos when I first heard about this case, I don't know why, but it's like if I look at them long enough, they'll become less horrible to me. Does that make sense? And if they become less horrible to me, I won't think about them so much. I won't be so horrified by them. But so far that doesn't work. I have OCD and I tend to get stuck on a loop sometimes, and these photos messed me up. They're not graphic, they're not gory, no one is hurt in them, they show no harm. They're just terrifying because you know what happened to this girl after. I just can't imagine what she was thinking and what she was experiencing. It is horrific. But Robert Ben Rhoades did kill Regina just after taking these photos. Her body lay on this abandoned farm for months until a farmer doing a final walkthrough before tearing his barn down found her. She was found on September 29th, 1990, after being missing since February 3rd. She was bruised and beaten and broken, and authorities wanted to ensure that Robert Ben Rhoades was going to pay for what he did to her. September 11th, 1992. Robert Ben Rhoades pleads guilty to the murder of Regina, and he is sentenced to life without parole for that crime. As Robert sits in prison, he begins to talk, and he takes investigators back in time. They listen intently as he kind of picks and chooses which murders he will share with them, which he wants to talk about and which he doesn't. This is something we see all the time. Robert Hansen, the butcher baker, comes to mind. We know he only admitted to most of his killings, I believe around 11, but we know that he kept a map where he marked a red X for each of his kills, and that map had 14 or 15 red X's on it. Serial killers, according to profilers and people that work with them, tend to only want to remember the murders that go the way they want them to go. Serial killers live in a fantasy life. And if a murder doesn't go the way they fantasized it would, sometimes they don't count those kills and they don't want to talk about them. So Robert starts to talk about what he wants to talk about, and he talks about what he did in January of 1990. This event seems to be very clear in his mind. Robert picked up a couple who was hitchhiking in Texas. They were Patricia Candace Walsh, who went by Candace, and her new husband, Douglas Zyskowski. Almost immediately after picking the couple up, Robert killed Douglas and dumped his body in Sutton County, Texas. He then chained Candace up inside the mobile torture chamber he had constructed, and he kept her for about a week. Again, there isn't a whole lot I can say here about what she endured, but it was... yeah. Robert then murdered Candace and dumped her body in Millard County, Utah, specifically near the little town of Fillmore, which is about 2.5 hours north from where I'm sitting right now. Her body was later found by deer hunters in October of 1990. Douglas's body had been found just days after he was murdered, but he didn't have any ID on him, and investigators didn't identify him until Robert Ben Rhoades was caught. So now, with the help of the killer, investigators have closed 2 more murders, those of Douglas Zyskowski and of Candace Walsh. The investigators then put together another incident from 1990. About a month after Robert killed Candace Walsh, he abducted Shana Holts, who was 18 at the time. Shana got loose and escaped Robert, and she went to the police. They had arrested Robert back then and detained him, but then Shana changed her mind. She said she didn't feel like anyone was going to believe her. In the police file, she's quoted as saying, "I don't see any good in filing charges. It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence, I would file charges and sue him." I understand it's very difficult to go after your kidnapper and your assaulter. I do. But if the victims won't testify, we don't have a chance of stopping these men. Shana had spent almost 2 weeks locked in that sleeper cab, in that torture chamber, suffering greatly. And now she would know, in this day and age, that there would be DNA everywhere in that truck. But back in 1990, she didn't have that to back her up. So while I wish she would have pursued charges, I do understand how difficult it is, even now, let alone back then. Then Robert pretty much stops talking. There are a lot of theories online as to why. Some people say he can't remember. Some people say he's holding information, hoping for some type of a reward. And some people say he's just plain evil and doesn't want to give out any information. But if you want to know what I think, I don't think Robert Ben Rhoades can give much information on many of the women he killed, because I don't think he even bothered to ask them their names. He picked these women up at truck stops or hitchhiking. They were alone, they were desperate, and they meant absolutely nothing to this man. Psychopaths see other human beings as objects. They're not human to them. Robert wouldn't care to ask these women anything about themselves. He might remember where he dumped some of them, but in my opinion, and I could most definitely be wrong about this, I don't know that he has any information to give because he simply didn't care enough to find anything out about these poor people. Once authorities knew about the murders of Douglas and Candace, Robert was extradited to Utah in 2005 to stand trial for those 2 deaths. But when the prosecutors began speaking with the families of the victims, the families did not want to go through with the trial. Robert had already been sentenced to life without parole. He was never getting out. So the prosecutors did as the families asked, and they dropped the charges. Robert later pled guilty to Douglas and Candace's murders in order to have the death penalty taken off the table. Robert Ben Rhoades is still alive, my friends. This is what he looks like today, and he is sitting in a cell at the maximum security Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. He is 77 years old. In 2015, a woman was scrolling on Facebook looking at a true crime page when suddenly she saw her own face staring back at her. This is the post she saw. It was asking for help identifying the woman in the photo, and she knew she was the woman in the photo. The woman's name is Pamela Milliken, and she remembers when Robert Ben Rhoades snapped that photo of her. She was hitchhiking to Winnipeg to go and find her brother. She stuck out her hand as a semi rolled past, and it stopped and picked her up. As she sat next to Robert, he snapped the photo and told her he takes photos of everyone he picks up, so if they rip him off, he has a photo to show to the police. Wow, these guys very often have their own defense already worked out, don't they? At least in their minds. Robert talked with Pamela for a bit, and then he pointed at a sign he had handwritten on his dashboard. It said, "Cash, grass, or ass, no one rides for free." She later said, "I had no money and no pot, so I knew which one it would be." She had consensual sex with Robert to pay for her ride, and he then drove her to Winnipeg and dropped her off at a bus station. This is Pamela now. She says she often wonders why she was let go, and why she never spent any time in the box under the seats of the truck. I wonder why. Like many of you, the reason these stories fascinate me is my desire to understand why some people do terrible things and why some of those same people let certain victims go. These are the questions that keep us guessing. And for now, we will have to remain guessing indefinitely. Robert Ben Rhoades will be dead soon, and he will take the secrets of the ghosts he left along the way to the grave with him. I would like to believe that he will meet those ghosts, and that the questions we will never have answers to are answered for then. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. If you would like to support me and our community here, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. You can also join my Patreon. If you want to donate $1 a month, that's great with me. It helps support the channel, and the end goal there is to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money to test it. We want to help with that. We want to help close those cold cases, and we want to get the perpetrator's DNA in the system. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your day with me. I appreciate it more than you'll ever know. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.